There are eras when history itself dons a mask. And no mask was ever more dazzling, or more deceptive, than the one that hid the true face of the age of Louis XIV, the Sun King. We are accustomed to seeing his epoch in gold and marble, in the glitter of the Hall of Mirrors and the stately rhythm of the minuet. We see a ballet, performed for the public. But if you peer behind this gilded screen, into the shadowy corridors where the light of the chandeliers does not reach, another story lies hidden. A story written not in ink, but in poison. A history where love was not an emotion, but politics, a romance a tool of diplomacy, and jealousy a crime against the state. In this world, a whisper against a wall was louder than a cannon's roar, and a smile could be deadlier than a blade. And at the very heart of this brilliant nightmare, she reigned, Athénaïs de Montespan. Not merely a mistress, but the uncrowned Queen of France. Her red hair was a flame that scorched her rivals, her wit, a trap for her enemies. She basked in the glow of the monarch's favor, bore the king children, and her whims were law. It seemed she had reached the pinnacle. But every pinnacle has its other side, an abyss. And so begins the hidden truth, which court transcripts call the affair of the poisons, and which court chroniclers tried to erase from memory. When the charms of her beauty began to fade, when the throne beneath her began to tremble, Madame de Montespan went beyond intrigue. Beyond courtly gossip. She stepped into a world of darkness. She, the brilliant marquise, would secretly steal into the slums of Paris, into the cellars of sorceresses, to take part in the most monstrous ritual of all, the Black Mass. Why? What drove a woman who had everything to risk not just her position, but her life, and her very soul? This is a story about the price of love in a court where sincerity has no place. A story of how absolute power breeds absolute fear. And of the desperation that leads a person to wear a silk glove, hiding not the scent of perfume, but a deadly poison. Prepare to learn the story that Versailles itself tried to forget. To understand the desperation of Madame de Montespan, you must understand more than just the palace. You must understand the mechanism. Imagine a giant, perfectly polished clock. Every gear, every cog is in its place. The ticking of this clock is the rustle of silk gowns, the chime of crystal, the click of heels on parquet. And the pendulum, setting the rhythm for this entire intricate system, is one, His Majesty the King. Versailles was a gilded cage with bars made of etiquette. Here, everything was subject to ritual. Who had the right to hand the king his shirt? To light his candle? Who could walk through a door first? Careers, fortunes, the fates of entire families depended on it. In this universe, the favor of the Sun King was not merely a privilege. It was oxygen. Without it, you were suffocated. Slowly and elegantly. And into this cage, they admitted a rare, beautiful bird. Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart, the Marquise de Montespan. She was not one to twitter timidly in a corner. Her arrival at court was like a flash of light. She didn't just eclipse her predecessor, the meek Louise de la Vallière. She erased her. La Vallière was moonlight, quiet, devoted, sorrowful. Montespan was the midday sun, dazzling, scorching, relentless. Her power seemed absolute. She became the maîtresse déclarée in the second half of the 17th century. Her apartments were connected to the king's by a secret staircase. She bore Louis VII children, cementing her position more firmly than any marriage contract ever could. Her brother was made a duke. Her will decided ministerial appointments and the outcomes of military campaigns. A whispered Madame de Montespan disapproves could shatter a reputation built over decades. But a gilded cage, no matter how luxurious, is still a cage. Her position was fundamentally precarious. She was the mistress, not the queen. Her title depended on a single, fickle emotion, the love of a monarch. And in a court where new, fresh, hungry faces appeared every day, this was a lottery with a fatal outcome. She knew, what is granted by favor can be taken away by a single whim. And this fear became her eternal, shadow companion. It hid in the folds of her velvet gowns, in the glitter of her diamonds, in the sweet taste of the wine she drank. It whispered to her at night that all of this was temporary. And this whisper grew more insistent with each passing day. Because new clouds were gathering on the horizon of Versailles, and their names were Marie Angélique de Fontanges and Françoise d'Aubigné, the future Madame de Maintenon. Her sun was beginning to set, and she, like a woman possessed, was searching for a way to stop the relentless march of time. The idyll could not last forever. Like any sun, Louis began to pass his zenith. The king was past 40, an age of reckoning. The wars of the Spanish succession were draining the treasury, rumors of conspiracies ran rampant, and news from Paris told of strange poisonings and witches' orgies. The brilliant monarch, whose youth had seemed boundless, began to ponder sin, death, and the salvation of his soul. The wind at court, sensitive to the slightest shift in the monarch's mood, began to change direction. Unbridled joy and hedonism were falling out of fashion. In their place came piety, restraint, and virtue. And in this new spiritual atmosphere, the spirits of the old times, the frivolous, the sinful, began to feel uneasy. And so, on this new, twilight horizon of Versailles, a quiet but inexorable star began to rise. Françoise d'Aubigné, the widow of the poet Scarron, now the governess to the king's children, Madame de Maintenon. She was the absolute opposite of Montespan. Not a dazzling beauty, but a prudent and devout widow. Her weapon was not passion, but virtue. Not scandalous wit, but calm wisdom. And in this new climate, that weapon proved deadly. For Athenaeus, it was a nightmare come true. She watched as the king, weary of her stormy jealous scenes, her insatiable thirst for luxury and attention, sought solace more and more often in quiet conversations with Maintenon. With her, he spoke not of fashions and ballets, but of God, of duty, of the future of France. These conversations lasted for hours. And with every passing hour, Montespan felt her power melting away like ice in the first spring sun. She was an actress in a play that had suddenly gone out of style. Her charms, her beauty, her brilliance, everything that had constituted her power now seemed vulgar and outdated. She fought back with her old methods, she staged scenes, demanded proofs of love, showered the king with reproaches. But these barbs only pushed him further away, making him value all the more the steady, warm light that emanated from Maintenon. Desperation is a poor counselor, but its claws are sharp. It scratched at her from the inside, robbing her of sleep and reason. If the prayers she had never, it seemed, uttered sincerely, were of no use. If her charms no longer worked, perhaps there were other forces. Forces that feared neither sin nor hell? Forces that could bind a man's love, rekindle a faded passion, or remove a tiresome rival from the path. And here, in her story, appears the first, faint scent of sulphur. Through Paris, from mouth to mouth, crept a name spoken by some with a sneer, and by others with fear and hope. The name of a woman who solved the most delicate problems for ladies of quality. Problems of love, and, as would soon become apparent, of death. Her name was Catherine Monvoisin, but everyone knew her as La Voisin. And for a falling star named Athenaeus de Montespan, she was to become a new guiding thread. Even if it led straight to the inferno. While Versailles danced the minuet, a different kind of life festered in the Parisian suburb of Saint-Denis, in an unremarkable house on Rue Beauregard. Here, under the cover of night, gathered those for whom courtly intrigue had reached a dead end. They arrived in carriages with curtained windows, under assumed names, seeking a final, desperate argument in their battle for power, love, or revenge. This was the anti-Versailles, a shadow kingdom, and it had its queen. Catherine Monvoisin, La Voisin, was a genius of the underworld. A midwife, fortune-teller, herbalist, and entrepreneur. She created and ran a vast criminal network that trafficked in the court's most common commodities, human fear and vice. Her clientele was the cream of French aristocracy. She sold everything: love potions made from bat's blood and menstrual fluid, abortifacient herbs, cosmetics laced with mercury, powders of immortality, and, of course, poisons, colorless, tasteless, and untraceable. But the crown jewel of her services, her true specialty, was a specific ceremony. The Black Mass. A ritual performed by none other than Abbé Guibord, a fallen priest for whom blasphemy had become a business. This was not mere magic. It was a staging of her client's most potent fantasy, the ability to compel divine, or diabolical, forces to serve their most personal, most base desires. The ritual was a monstrous parody of the Catholic Mass. Sacred texts were read backward. The crucifix was inverted. The host was not a wafer, but a mixture of blood from sacrificed infants, flour, and bone ash. The names of victims and patrons were woven into satanic prayers. Poisons and amulets consecrated in this manner were believed to be imbued with demonic power. The goal could be anything: to bind the king's love, to ruin a hated rival, to remove an inconvenient husband. Imagine it. The brilliant marquise, whose name was synonymous with luxury and power, standing in that hellish smoke among thieves and murderers. She, who was accustomed to command, was now reduced to pleading. She, whose beauty had driven kings mad, now participated in a ritual where life was worthless. What kind of desperation must have been burning within her to resort to this? She commissioned masses for the king's health, and masses for the demise of his new lover, Mademoiselle de Fontanges. She begged for eternal love, and eternal death for her enemies. The devil, as they say, does not deal in coin. He demands souls. And Madame de Montespan was ready to pay. She was not merely buying a love potion. She was buying the illusion of control in a world where she was losing it completely. She believed dark magic could restore what was slipping through her fingers, the love of the Sun King. But the shadow she stepped into was far longer and more dangerous than she could have imagined. And that shadow, in the form of the royal investigator Nicolas de la Reynie, had already begun its slow, inexorable crawl toward her. Hell has one inescapable property: sooner or later, its fire breaks free. The spark that lit the fuse was the death of one of the poisoners linked to Voisin. Lists of clients were found among his belongings. And so began the affair of the poisons, the century's most sensational judicial drama, one the king himself would have preferred to bury in oblivion. The investigation was led by a man whose integrity was as unyielding as the walls of the Bastille, Nicolas de la Reynie. Under torture, the web of lies began to unravel. Executioners, alchemists, perfumers, and midwives began to name names. First, minor courtiers. Then, dukes and marquises. And then, under the torment of the water interrogation, La Voisin uttered a name that froze the blood in the investigator's veins. Madame de Montespan. The Sun King stood before an abyss. His official mistress, the mother of his children, was accused of black magic, desecration, attempted poisoning, and participation in rituals involving human sacrifice. A public trial would mean ruin. Not just personal, but dynastic. It would tarnish the very idea of the divine nature of royal power. How could God's anointed share his bed with a witch? And so, Louis made a Solomonic decision. The monarch's wrath fell upon the small fish. La Voisin was sentenced to be burned alive. Her execution at the Place de Grève became a public spectacle of horror. But as the executioner set the pyre alight, legend says she screamed, "I will say nothing," carrying her most terrible secrets to the grave. Or did she? For the prime accused, Madame de Montespan, a different punishment was devised. More refined, more Versailles. No formal charges were brought against her. There was no trial, no prison. Her sentence was silence. Her career as the royal favorite was ended instantly and irrevocably. She was permitted to remain at court formally, in honor, with her title and wealth. But it was not a life, it was an existence in a vacuum. Imagine this torture. To see the man you adored and tried to bind by any means, every single day. To watch the throne you once occupied pass to another, the modest, pious Maintenon, whose influence only grew. To feel upon you the gaze of the court, filled not with judgment, but with something worse, contemptuous silence. She became a ghost in her own court. Her power evaporated, leaving behind only the bitter residue of scandal and fear. She spent her final years in a show of piety and attempts to earn forgiveness, distributing alms and founding charities. But can the soul be cleansed from the soot of black candles? She died far from Versailles, never having received the king's forgiveness. Her fall was as meteoric as her rise had been brilliant. The final irony was this: the shadow she had summoned to preserve the light of her power had, in the end, consumed her utterly. The story of Madame de Montespan is more than a tale of witchcraft. It is the tragedy of a woman who was ultimately destroyed by the very system designed for her elevation. She played by the rules of Versailles, where love was a poison and beauty was a weapon. And when that weapon grew dull, she, in her desperation, reached for the darkest power she could find. She risked everything because the brilliance of absolute power always casts an absolute shadow. And sometimes, that shadow answers when called. Thank you for joining us. Tell us in the comments, which other historical favorite, whose story is rich with secrets and intrigue, would you like us to explore next?